When it started, I'm not exactly sure. At some point, I noticed we didn't seem to have as many cats as we once did. That in itself wasn't all that much. These are, in many cases, feral cats, and in other cases, they are cats that people did not want any longer, and they found out we take all cats in. So they drove out one day and dumped their cats on us. It isn't anything that is advertised, just word of mouth, and there isn't any sort of official process. You just drive out to our business and push your cat out the door of the car. I used to believe every cat was destined to make it to our farm that got dropped off out in front. Then I found out that only a percentage of them were making it. Something was cutting down their numbers. And then it started coming onto the farm. I didn't believe there was a problem. What follows is much of what I wrote in reports so that you may notice that I don't mention the loss of cats at first. I can't go in too much detail or I would risk giving away my anonymity. Suffice to say, I work and live on a farm in Oregon that grows grass seed. Most specifically, we grow bluegrass grass seed. We have other seeds as well, but our bread and butter remains the bluegrass seed. Every year we harvest the seed and store it in large barns until we can get it sacked into 50-pound sacks. After we get the seed sacked up, it is transported across the nation and sold at various lawn stores. Our operation is in a valley which is surrounded by mountains. The terrain around the valley is basically large pine tree forests which follow the mountain upwards until the tree line where they stop being so abundant. So basically our farm is surrounded by pine forests which is a home to many wild animals including both mountain lions and occasionally wolves. Bobcats and smaller mammals which might not be considered at the very top of the food chain are also abundant and certainly capable of being predator to the many cats we keep on the farm. Some are feral and some are tame. They do the job of keeping down the number of mice and other pests which would eat our seed. The cat population on the seed farm is always healthy. This is probably what they would consider paradise since they have plenty of mice to hunt and they have plentiful shelter and water. It is literally an orgy for the cats, which few, if any, have ever been to a vet to be neutered or spayed. During the day, when the men are here working, the cats stay out of the way. Many just sleep and wait for the night. There truly isn't a lot of fighting among the cats during the daylight hours. For someone like myself that stays here on the farm during the night, the night hours, things are quite different. Understand there are several large barns that serve specific purposes, and the cats patrol all of them to keep the mice population under control. It is not uncommon at all for me to hear some knockdown, drag out through the mud fights going on among the cats. If you've never been around a large population of cats, then you probably are unaware of just how noisy they can be at night. The sound of their fighting and wailing is very intimidating because they make every battle sound like it is to the death, and perhaps it is, I couldn't say. I can only speak on how serious they sound. Can't say it is always true, but it is my experience that the feral cats are usually a little tougher than the tame cats, or so it seems, because most of the time I will see the tame cats back away from a fight with one of the feral cats, which is really more odd than it would first sound due to the fact that the feral cats are just so incredibly spastic. You can just fake a move in their direction and they scatter like cockroaches when the light's turned on. Despite that fact, they are not so quick to jump away when approached by another cat, especially the tame cats. When you exist within a confined area, one quickly learns about all the other animals or creatures living within that space. As shy around people as they are known to be, even deer will become accustomed to the presence of humans as long as no violence is done toward them. Feral cats are no different. If they are around you enough and you don't do anything violent toward them, then they will eventually let down their guard. I even have a couple of them that are so trusting around me that they will turn their backs on me while cleaning or sunning themselves. I even have a few of the feral cats that are basically like my pets, although they would never let me actually touch them. They are the group within the group. I call them the Pophia. They make the choice to shadow me when I do my rounds and will move out in front of me which I take as them guarding me. It is quite endearing since they are not tame cats. Oddly, the tame cats have never chose to go on rounds with me, but it could be due to the fact that the feral cats are there and the two groups, while capable of interaction, generally keep separate. The main character of the Papia is the male whom I call Dillinger, big Siamese male Tom. He has his generals whom I call Babyface and Pretty Boy, who I am pretty sure are both girls. They have a couple more whom I call Blackbeard, Batcat, Captain Kidd, and the youngest of the bunch, Billy the Kitten, outlaws all. So the Papia is usually with me on rounds, though it is usually just a couple of them. Once in a while I get the whole pack at once, but usually it's just two or three of them. I walk the property once a night as I am what passes for security. Weekends I will go sometimes a second time around if I happen to be awake or if there has been something happen which calls for increased security. On more than one occasion, the Papia has acted strange about the area we are coming upon. Twice I had seen one of the cats go jump ahead and acting strange like it was after a mouse or some other type of prey, but I was never able to spot what it was that the cat went charging after. In any case, the behavior was very distinct, and I got the impression the cat was acting not as a predator, but more like it was acting to defend me or myself and the rest of the pack. Pretty Boy went charging ahead and then stopped right where the lights stopped and the shadows began. Anything could have been hiding in the darkness. Next, things began to escalate because of the strong odor of what I would describe as hot garbage, wet dog, and sour earth. The cats were out of there with the exception of both Pretty Boy and Babyface. They had stayed with me, but were very uneasy. Both sat just in front of me, facing the shadowed darkness where our lights didn't reach. Their tails were switching back and forth, their bodies the exact opposite of relaxed. Pretty Boy walked up and sat down, joining Babyface in the same squatted position. They reminded me totally of this cat we had years before, whom we called Fast Cat. He was a big old Tom that ruled the roost around our place. He didn't have any dogs to contend with that lived there with him. So one day when the followers of those big hot air balloons showed up at our house because their balloon was getting ready to set down in our pasture, they had brought along their two dogs. The dogs barreled out of the vehicle and tried to come on our property, but they were immediately met by Fast Cat, who proceeded to have those dogs off our property and standing out on the blacktop road that our house was next to. Fast Cat stood at the front yard, sitting exactly the way these two cats were sitting now. Fast Cat was looking from one of the dogs to the other, just waiting for one of them to try and come on the property, and that was the one he went after. Fast Cat was quite serious then, and I strongly suspected that Babyface and Pretty Boy were just as much now. Whatever was hiding in the dark shadows was something these cats took very seriously and that sent the other cats racing off to hide. Well, I have done a little bit of research on feral cats, so admittedly I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but what I learned told me that the feral cats that I called Pretty Boy and Babyface had chosen me as being their human. According to the research I read, feral cats will actually connect to a human if they feel trust toward them. According to the research, if they will eat in front of you, or if they will show a relaxed body, or if they sleep near where you are located, then you have probably been chosen by them to be their human. Pretty Boy and Babyface were my most loyal and wildcat friends. The entire group, which I called the Papia, they accepted me. They had no problem with my presence. However, as I mentioned, when things got dicey, the other cats fled. But Pretty Boy and Babyface were queerly uncomfortable, but they held their ground. Their fur was standing straight up, their tails switched this way and then that, and their eyes never left the darkness that was where I had planned on going next. The farm had 3 really big barns, and there existed an alley which separated the first 2 buildings, and if you got past that point, there was yet another dark alley to pass through before reaching the last building. It was clear the cats felt that there was something in the darkness that was dangerous. Now, I've never been one to go around against the flow. Don't get me wrong, if there's a mystery, I will be quick to throw all caution to the wind in order to satisfy my curiosity. However, when I see two feral cats refusing to go into the dark alley and they are adamant about not taking their eyes off the darkness, I take the hint. Plus, I was getting a stronger whiff of whatever it was that was creating that odor, and that was plenty incentive to not want to go forward. I am much less afraid of bleeding than I am of stinking. If you have ever had a dog sprayed by a skunk, then you are aware of just how hard it is to get rid of that stink. So in the end, I chose not to go forward. I didn't have any trouble at all getting the cats to go back the way we came. It was the first night of strangeness, but far from the last. In fact, things escalated from that point. As the weather became colder, the weirdness became bolder. As it was well into the fall months when this all happened, it meant the big barns were either full or being filled with the grass seed that had been recently harvested. Oftentimes, we are more in a hurry to get the seed out of the elements than we are worried about doing anything in a neat or organized manner. Therefore, it results in big piles of grass seed sometimes being accumulated inside the barns, and then we worry about later about getting it separated and sacked. And the point being, the seed gets to a certain point, you don't want it to get wet. Therefore, our first concern is always to get the seed inside where we can control the environment. So inside the big barns were very tall piles of grass seed waiting to be sacked up. All the lighting in the barns is provided from above, so with the tall piles of grass seed, there are definite areas where the shadows rule and the light is in scarce availability. This was exactly the circumstance I encountered the very next night after deciding to not go into that dark alley. The next day I was no longer afraid of what might be waiting in the dark. I checked out the alley in question and I could not find any tracks or prints, but that didn't really come as a big surprise because as long as you hugged one side or the other of the alley, there was enough overhang from the barn roof to keep the ground dry enough it would not show any footprints. I did, however, notice there was a spot that appeared to be beaten down like maybe something had been waiting there, perhaps pacing, but being aware of where the ground became damp enough to register a footprint and being careful to stay away from that conclusion. I pursued various tasks which were my normal work chores, and the day eventually came to an end. I opted for a nap before taking on the night. I woke up just as the sun was setting. Once again, Pretty Boy and Babyface accompanied me on my rounds. There was nothing out of the ordinary until I got to the last building. The lock to the side entrance door had been broken or wrenched off, and the door was slightly open. I could hear something moving around in the barn. I turned on the lights, which created a huge room full of dark shadowed areas that would require my passing through them if I wanted to check out the entire building. Almost immediately, the two cats were acting strange. When I made a move to walk through an area which was very dark, the cats would not let me go further. Of course, I could have pushed my way past them, but I had too much respect for their abilities to simply ignore the fact that they were anxious. In fact, I began to feel like I had made a mistake, that I should get out of there, that I needed to get out of there. That odor was once again strong. Smelling it so near was the convincing straw that led me to back out the following same path I took to get in. Just as I was back to the side door entrance, there came a hugely loud roar. Both the cats and myself went racing back the way we had come, and we didn't stop running until we were back at the main office. Even then, I wasted little time locking things up and getting the hell out of there. I must admit the cats were left to fend for themselves, something I had little choice in since I couldn't get the feral cats to go with me in my vehicle. It came as no surprise, and I didn't worry about them. Cats are pretty good at taking care of themselves. I left the farm that night and came back in the morning when the employees would be there. The thing was that I needed the job, and plus it was a good one to have because I was supplied with a place to stay and I didn't have a boss standing over my shoulder all the time, so I wasn't about to walk away from this just based on one growl. It was a usual Wednesday and the plant was in the mode of getting the large piles of seed sacked up so it can be shipped. The entire day the weather was overcast, making it a rather chilly day, which eased into cold quickly once the sun set. I put off doing my rounds until everyone had left because I didn't want to stumble upon a late working employee and have them see me freaking out thinking it was something else. Pretty Boy and Babyface were with me like usual, and this evening we were also accompanied by two other members of the Papia, Blackbeard and Batcat, the latter having received her name because she so liked to be in an elevated location. Once I would enter a room and have the feeling something was watching me, only to discover Batcat looking down at me from someplace up in the rafters. Both cats were the traditional black cat that you were supposed to turn around and go the other way when you came upon one. If you are superstitious, anyways. I am not. I made that choice after I broke my third or fourth mirror in the stretch of about a year. I figured if I believed in superstition, then I just bought myself 28 years of bad luck. I wasn't about to sign up for that, so right then I decided I'm not superstitious. I believe it was a decision that has benefited me greatly through my life. Building 1 was dead. Nobody in there and nothing going on. That was a good thing, of course. The cats raced in and out of my flashlight beam as we continued our way toward the second building. Each building has two doors, and it was our habit to enter one and walk through the barn and exit the remaining door. From there was a walk down an alley to where we would enter the next building. Inside the barns were sacks of 50 pounds of grass seed bagged up and ready to be shipped. Also, there was an area where the seed was not yet bagged, which made large piles of seed that reached nearly to the ceiling. It created shadows everywhere. To add to the creepiness, when you walked past a large pile of seed, sometimes you would dislodge enough of it to cause an avalanche. This could be small streams of seed falling down, and sometimes they could be nearly half the pile. Most of the time it was the smaller streams. The cats were notorious for setting off avalanches whenever we passed the large piles of seed. They were so likely to do it that most times, if I had more than a couple cats wanting to go with me, that I would have to make an effort to assure the cats didn't cause a lot of damage. The thing is that the seed is easier to handle when you have gravity on your side. To further explain, and you can try this at home, it is much easier to shovel something going downhill than it is to go uphill or even at a level rate. And plus, the seed at the bottom of the pile gets mixed up with other kinds of seed. It is inevitable. We learned the hard way. It is just too hard to keep them separate after all that bagging is done. It isn't a big problem because we also sell mixes, but as you might expect, it is much easier to mix more seed if necessary than to have too much mixed and not be able to separate it. As such, an effort is made to keep things separate and ideally to keep the piles high as opposed to them being spread out, causing the bagging process to be more trouble than it would have been otherwise. Perhaps I should have mentioned sooner this happened more than 10 years ago. The process for bagging the seed has changed considerably since then. In case you were thinking there should be machines that do it, there are. There were machines which did it back then, but we didn't have very many of them. The big thing about all that is, again, getting the seed inside to avoid the rains. That was always the most important aspect, and what money was spent was usually focused on that part of the business. It was much smarter to spend your money on building another big barn to house your seed than it was to spend it on machines which would help you bag the stuff quicker. This is all basic business stuff. It isn't to say we didn't have the machines. We had three of them, one on each in each building. We needed 3 times that many, and if we didn't want the seed to pile up. Also understand that such big barns would have been scary even if they were empty, but since they were each filled with multiple large piles of seed, and then there were the pallets of bagged seed, and also stacked up nearly to the rafters, it created many, many places for something to hide, even something that was very large. Each of the barns was likely to have several cats in them at any given time, so even without the Papia members accompanying me, it was likely I would encounter a few avalanches as the cats were moving around. The second barn provided examples of such because when we got in there, the first thing that happened was we heard 2 separate avalanches begin. Blackbeard and Batcat both moved ahead into the darkness while the other 2 cats stayed back with me. Looking back on it as I am writing about this, I realize more than ever that these cats were looking after me. They must have known there was trouble possible, and this was their way of making sure I was okay. And I won't lie, after that first night encountering the growl, I was happy to have all the company that the cats wanted to supply. We bumped into more of the tame cats in the second barn than I think I had ever seen in there at one time. Some more of the Papia were also in there hunting. By the time I had made it through the maze of piles of loose seed, pallets of sacked seed, and hunting cats both feral and tamed, I was pretty amped up. Every cat that appeared in my light beam was a shock for the most part. Understand, I was afraid every sign of movement might belong to whatever it was that had made that growl. Black bears visit the farm every year, but they seldom come down into the area where the barns are at because, besides the alleys between the barns, there isn't much for cover. Grass seed isn't something the bears eat, so they don't come into the barns because we don't have anything in them which the bears might want to eat. Well, except for the cats. Okay, yes, the cats would be on the bears' menu. However, I'm pretty sure that the bears do not hold common house cats as being very high on their list of desired meals. Even if the bear did manage to catch one, it would be a small meal that consisted mostly of fur and bones. Upon reaching the exit door of the second building, I felt my chest bulge with anxiety. There may be something waiting for me once I stepped out into the dark alley. I eased the exit door open, and just then Pretty Boy and Babyface went shooting past my legs and out into the alley. I took an extra second to think to myself whether I was sure I wanted to stay and fight for this job. It is one thing to tell yourself you can be brave, you can do whatever it takes. But when you're standing there looking at a dark alley where the night before something scary, something you were pretty sure was big, had let go a growl that almost made you crap your pants, it's enough to make you change your mind. Well, enough time had slipped past that I actually ended up sort of racing out into the alley because I was afraid I had hesitated too long and the creature had got Pretty Boy or Babyface, but they were there. They were in search and destroy mode. The three of us quietly made our way down the dark alley headed for the building number 3. The fact that it had been chilly all day and now was straight out cold that night had arrived did not make the task of checking the buildings any more pleasant. It was in fact a motivation to hurry up and finish checking the buildings and get back to some place warm. I not only had some soup keeping warm, but I had also bought a bottle of hooch while I was out. I fully intended on putting a good dent in it after I had finished the evening endeavors. Walking down the alley between the two buildings, I kept flicking my flashlight beam from right to left and then back again. It was so dark that I didn't trust the light to be certain to illuminate everything that was there unless I ran the beam over every possible inch. Hell, for all I knew, this growler might be one of those hide-behinds I had just recently started hearing about. They are apparently huge, but can hide behind almost anything regardless of size. Hey, we reached the entry door to building number 3. First thing I noticed was that the door hadn't been locked. Sigh. Common enough for the crew, especially near the end of the week. I pushed the door open far enough to let me slip through. I felt rather than saw the two cats enter with me. Both of them touched my legs in their haste to get inside ahead of me. The first thing I noticed was out of the ordinary was the lack of cats in the building. I almost always saw at least one cat whenever I entered a barn. I had taken 5 or 6 steps inside and still hadn't seen a single cat. And even stranger was that there was no avalanches happening. Normally, under such conditions, the simple act of having entered the building and shining a light around would have been enough to cause one of the cats to move quicker than it probably would normally have, and that is all it takes to set off a small avalanche. Then these things all happened at the same time. I rounded one of the big piles of seed and was immediately hit with a horribly offensive odor. The cats, who were just ahead of me, went from a moving forward pace to slamming on their brakes, and I watched their little bodies slide on the loose grass seed. Their ears went back, and both of them were hissing and growling, and their fur was all stood up. I hadn't been moving fast enough for it to cause me to slide when I slammed on my brakes. That doesn't mean I didn't encounter trouble. I found plenty. As everything else was happening, the top half of my body was still in active play, even if my bottom half had stopped moving forward. And I got the light into a position to illuminate this huge dark area we had just walked into, and what I saw first made me go into the highest level of defense mode. There was blood everywhere. At first I thought somebody had been knifed or maybe shot with a silencer, and then I saw the fur. Pieces of it were clinging to the slopes of the grass seed pile. It had to be at least 2 cats, and I wouldn't have been surprised to find out there were 6 dead cats involved. There wasn't time for a lot of detective work. Avalanches started happening on piles of seed I had not gotten near. From the far end of the building was from where the first avalanche started, and then there was another, and then another, and about the 4th avalanche I figured out they were getting closer. The cats were meowing like crazy, and it was obvious they wanted to leave. In fact, they were leaving it. It was just a matter of whether I was going with them. As I turned to follow the cats back toward the door we had come in, I began to smell it. The odor came at me soft at first, but then it was overpowering. The flashlight beam bounced off the piles of grass seed and located the door. Now I could hear it moving back behind us. It had heavy, wet breath that completely reminded me of being near a horse that had just done some running. Whatever it was, it had a huge set of lungs on it. The cats arrived at the door first, and they were quite uneasy as they waited for me to catch up and open it. I had time to see them pacing back and forth, caught in the beam of the flashlight as I continued to try and keep the door lit so I could get us out of there even faster. I flung the door open and did a sprint to the second building doorway. The cats were right there with me, so I didn't have to wait on them when I opened it. I quickly locked the door and continued to sprint through the maze of obstacles headed for the doorway out of there. When we got back to the first barn where the main office is located, I grabbed a few things and headed for the company truck. The night was still relatively young, but I wasn't going back to the farm. I needed the job and wasn't ready to give up on things, but when you've had the crap scared out of you 2 nights in a row, it is time to take a step back and rethink your approach. I didn't have any clue as to what to do, but the night before I had basically only got a couple hours sleep, so I needed to get a good night's sleep so I could think properly. I opted to drive to the nearest town with a motel. I was going to get a good meal and then get some sleep. It was also time to get some help, or at least to try and find somebody that might be interested in hunting big game. As I drove to the nearest town to get a hotel room, I went over my options. I could call the police, but to be honest, I've never been that guy. I don't have a lot of faith in the cops. I've seen how lazy they are, how corrupt some of them are, and frankly, I see them as an organized crime that I cannot avoid, but that I will never choose to bring them closer into my life. And here's a great example that I can be quick telling about. I had an off-road motorcycle stolen when I was in my 20s. Being so green, I foolishly called the cops and reported the theft. They sent out an officer who took the info and left. A week later, I got a notice they had found the bike. All I had to do was go into the Kansas City, Kansas courthouse and I could claim my property. So I took off a day from work and went in only to find out that I had to have a title for the bike, which was an off-road. It never came with a title. I tried to explain, but they refused to let me have the bike. And next I'm told it would be put up for auction where everybody but myself was allowed to bid on the bike. That's what I think of working with the police. Now all my friends were out of distance, were too busy for me to consider bothering them. It really left me with two options since I wasn't rich enough to buy backup. I could continue to face the matter by myself, where maybe I could find someone that worked at the farm to hang around after their shift was ended. Or I could always run away, but that remained an option I wasn't ready to consider. That night I had a nightmare. Something I couldn't see was chasing me. We were inside one of the barns. The grass seed was piled up. It was basically exactly like it was at the farm. I drove to work that next morning determined to find somebody who would help. The good news is that I already had weapons available. The farm keeps a rifle, a shotgun, and plenty of bear spray, and a 9-meter pistol, and it would be foolish not to. So I thought if I could find a brave soul during the shift to stay out after and help out, that we would have ample ammunition and weapons. I did stop and pick up 2 adequate flashlights, and I also bought a chain strong enough to hold an elephant, just in case. I found someone before lunch, a young man in his lower 20s. I bought him lunch and promised a case of beer to drink when the night was over. All he had to do was walk the grounds with me and after the shift ended and the sun had set, a short hour separating the two. I spent that hour getting us both prepared. I gave Bob a pump action 12 gauge that was missing its plug, so the gun held 5 before needing a reload. I carried the same 9mm automatic handgun that I always had with me after hours, plus I brought the bear spray. Bob had heard talk from the employees working in Building 3. I hadn't cleaned up from the night before, so somebody had come in first to find the cats all slaughtered. Gossip varied from a very hungry bear to Satan worshippers. Since nothing else was bothered, the crew manager just had it cleaned up and went on with daily business. On a side note, I wondered, had something like that ever happened before and it been brushed under the rug? If nothing else, it proves that all things, no matter how small, should be noted in the notes for security. Bob seemed excited about having something exciting to do. As I was less optimistic the evening would prove to be something we would want to remember, As I sat in the office looking out the window watching the last of the daylight disappear, there was time for us to down a couple of beers before we went on rounds. While I did want us to be sober, I won't lie, I needed the liquid courage even if Bob was good to go without it. When I felt myself wanting to reach out for that third beer, I made myself say it was time. A good number of the Papia had gathered around us while we were drinking. I don't know how many were going with us on rounds, but I worried that there would be tripping if I had all of them go. Feral or not, they had come to trust me enough that they could be underfoot, which would not be helpful if I had to get out of there in a hurry. The cats didn't seem to mind Bob, which spoke well for him in my eyes. When we got up to go on rounds, four of the Papia went with us. The two usual Confederates, Pretty Boy and Babyface, and this time Blackbeard and the King, Dillinger, was also accompanying us. The walk through building number 1 was uneventful. Once outside that first exit door, we followed the dark alley down to where we could enter building number 2. The air felt heavy. There was no wind. It was a little warmer than usual for the time of year, and I noticed the new flashlights did a much better job of illuminating what we were walking toward. That alone was a huge relief. When we left building number 1, a quiet fell over all of us. Often the cats would meow out in front of me when on patrol, but today they stayed quiet and seemed very focused. They also stayed just ahead of us, but within the reach of the flashlight beams, which we were all too happy to provide light for them to lead the way. When we reached the door to enter building number 2, I fumbled for the keys, but finally got it open for us to enter. The place was seemingly normal. I saw the cats moving about doing their evening hunting. Avalanches could be heard starting all over the barn, which is consistent with it being full of cats moving about. We weaved in and out of the many little valleys created by the piles of seed. Finally, we came to an exit door, one more building to check, the one that had all the action. As we stood at the doorway, we checked our ammunition and weapons. The cats, all four, were sitting in front of us. They obviously wandered through the doorway before we went, which was okay with us. I fully expected Dillinger to lead the way, but I quickly found out why he was leader and had lasted so long at it. He was the last of the four through the door. And then again, I couldn't say much since we were happy to let the cats go first. The alley was the usual dark, but our new flashlights really lit it up. So far, so good. We walked to the entrance door to building number 3 without incident. The lock on the door was still broken, so there was no need to fumble for keys. This time around, the cats were hanging back, and I wondered if they knew something we didn't already. Bob and I stayed quiet. We used hand signals to speak, and I motioned I was going to open the door for him to have his gun ready. The door made a little bit of noise when I opened it, which was not to my preferences, but what can you do? None of the cats was making any effort to enter. Bob and I slipped back outside the door and let it shut. Up until that very moment, I hadn't really considered what we were going to do if we encountered something or someone that wasn't a bear or something common. I just couldn't believe it could be something that was out of the common experience. Now, however, we were in a position where it seemed just that sort of thing might take place. I dropped the chain I'd been carrying. There would be no need for it. Whatever was in that building was going to be too strong for us to overpower it and put it in chains. We would have to kill it or be killed. Was I ready for that? Did I want to be responsible for tomorrow's headlines reading how good-hearted Bob was killed because the security guy just had to know what was killing these cats? And still the job demanded I go through this building. I asked Bob to hang back and cover my backside. Maybe he would have time to get away if things went south. As I mentioned, the cats were not going inside. As I mentioned, the cats were not going inside. I guess they figured they had done all they could to prevent my demise. If I wasn't smart enough to listen to them, then it was on me. I went back inside. The first thing I noticed was the lack of cats. I didn't see any of them. When I moved forward, I felt Bob's presence behind me. We made our way through the maze of piles of grass seed, but never saw anything. The only noise inside the place was the few avalanches of grass seed that we started. When I reached the back of the building, we turned around to work our way back, and all four of the cats we started out with were standing and waiting for us. They must have come in the door when Bob came back inside. It never occurred to me that they were escaping something that was outside until we had exited the building 3, and then I caught whiff of that horrible odor of wet dog, sour mud, and something else which was unpleasant. Perhaps hot garbage was the closest I could come to describe it. Regardless, it was a foul odor which I associated with something dangerous, something with a vicious-sounding growl, and something that liked to kill cats. The entire alley had a slight foul odor, and we made our way back to Building 2 with a mixture of feelings. I was relieved we didn't encounter anything inside Building 3, but just as I thought we were out of trouble, we stepped out into the night and caught that weird foul odor. The closer we got to going back inside Building Number 2, the more I was becoming anxious and I had been tricked. The feeling slammed home when we entered Building 2 and saw there were dead cats in pieces. The sound of the avalanches happening all over the building. Bob and I were both on extreme alert. I saw the head of one of the tame cats that I really liked. Part of his front paw was still attached to the head. I really wondered what the attraction was to these animals as food. They really were nothing but fur and bones. I continued walking through the building. There were parts of cats everywhere. This was going to be a major cleanup job in the morning. It didn't feel right asking Bob to stay and help me clean up, and frankly, it was too big a job for one person. Besides, things had reached a point where I needed to include the cops. The amount of time lost cleaning up the building might well be turned in for insurance. If it turned out to be the case, then there would need to be a police report. So for the next week, nothing happened. That very next night, I didn't do any rounds because the cops had taken control of the situation and I was able to step back. When the next day nothing was dead or torn up, the cops felt like they had done their job. And eventually it became clear that whatever it was that had been there and killed the cats had decided not to return. I got back into the habit of doing my rounds after the work shift ended. Everything was good until a week later, and it returned sometime after I had done rounds. Building 3 was once again hit. The lock on the door was still not fixed, and the new lock was ordered, but it hadn't been delivered yet. The cats had returned to their old habit of hunting at night, so they were taken by surprise. None of the poppy had been lost, but some more of the tame cats that I had started to like had been killed. The scene was just as before. There were dead cats scattered all around the building. This time the bosses decided to sink some money into the problem. Motion sensor lights were installed. Alarms were also installed. The lights made all the difference in my opinion. We never had another incident. I'd like to offer an exciting ending to the matter, but it just didn't happen that way. Things were very anticlimactic. So what was it that was killing all the cats? Well, since the happening, I have found out much more about Bigfoot, and I believe that was what was coming in onto the farm and killing the cats. Of course, it could have been a bear or something else more common, but based on the evidence and comparing the growl I remember with some of the noises I've heard played back of the Bigfoot sounds, I believe it's what we encountered.